the death of Alexander and the fragmentation of an empire. The world had never seen an empire like that of Alexander the Great. From the dusty plains of Greece to the towering cities of Persia and Egypt, Alexander carved out a realm that spanned continents. His name became synonymous with conquest, and for a moment, it seemed as though his ambition knew no bounds. But in the spring of 323 BCE, at the age of 32, the young king fell ill and died under mysterious circumstances in Babylon. This event marked the beginning of one of the most tumultuous and destructive periods in ancient history, the Wars of the Diadochi. A world in turmoil. As Alexander's body was prepared for burial, his empire was left in disarray. The sudden death of the king created a vacuum of power that no one, neither his generals nor his family, was prepared for. The empire was not only vast, but it was also fragile. Its strength had been built on Alexander's charisma, his vision, and his ability to unite a disparate army of Greeks, Macedonians, and even Persians under one banner. But without Alexander, there was nothing to keep it together. The question on everyone's mind was, who would take control of this immense empire? Was it to be his half-brother, Philip III Aridius, a man mentally unfit to rule? Or would it be his unborn son, Alexander IV, who had yet to take his first breath? The Diadochi, the generals and satraps who had served under Alexander, now saw an opportunity to carve out their own kingdoms. In a short period, the dream of a unified empire would dissolve into a bloody power struggle. The first moves, a dangerous game of power. The first moves after Alexander's death were characterized by political maneuvering and military alliances. Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, was one of the most powerful figures in the empire. He quickly assumed control over Greece, but his position was not secure. Greece, once pacified under Alexander, was on the verge of rebellion. The Peloponnesian League, once dominated by Macedon, stirred with the whispers of independence. In response, Antipater crushed the revolt in a series of brutal campaigns, but this was only the beginning of the conflict that would soon engulf the entire empire. Meanwhile, in the east, the Persians, eager to reclaim their homeland, began to show signs of resistance. The satraps of the former Persian Empire were no longer willing to remain under Macedonian rule. In Egypt, Ptolemy, a former companion of Alexander, saw an opportunity to consolidate power. He seized control of Alexandria and declared himself pharaoh, positioning himself as a leader in the newly emerging world. Antigonus, the dream of unification. Among the most ambitious of the Diadochi was Antigonus I Monophthalmus, a one-eyed veteran of many campaigns. He was determined to reunite Alexander's empire under his rule. His strategy was to control Asia Minor and the eastern territories, from where he could march towards the heart of the empire. However, Antigonus faced stiff opposition. Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, all powerful generals in their own right, had already set their sights on other regions. What followed was not simply a battle for territory but a struggle for ideology. Was it possible to maintain the unity of Alexander's empire, or was it destined to fracture into independent states? Some believed that the empire could remain intact under the rule of a single strong leader, while others saw the divisions as inevitable. Battle of Ipsus, the turning point. The decisive battle of the early Diadochi Wars occurred in 301 BCE at Ipsus in Phrygia. It was here that the forces of Antigonus clashed with the combined armies of Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus. This was not just a military engagement. It was a battle for the future of the empire. Antigonus, now in his 70s, had been relentless in his pursuit of power. But in this final showdown, his army was decisively defeated, and Antigonus was killed. His dream of reunification died with him. The Battle of Ipsus was not only a turning point in terms of military outcomes, but it also marked the fragmentation of Alexander's empire into distinct kingdoms. After Ipsus, the Diadochi were no longer just contenders for power. They became rulers in their own right, each with their own domain. The rise of the Ptolemies and Seleucids. After Antigonus' death, the empire was divided among the victors. Ptolemy took control of Egypt, while Seleucus secured the vast eastern territories. including Mesopotamia, Persia, and parts of India. Lysimachus gained control over Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. These divisions solidified, and each of these generals would go on to found dynasties that would rule for centuries. The Ptolemies, for instance, would rule Egypt until the death of Cleopatra VII, and the Seleucids would maintain control over much of the Near East. The consequences of Alexander's death. It is easy to look back and view the aftermath of Alexander's death as inevitable. A series of power struggles in a world that was always on the brink of war. But the truth is more complex. The breakdown of Alexander's empire was not just a result of external forces but of internal contradictions. Alexander had envisioned a world united by conquest, but he never left a clear plan for how to govern it. His generals, many of whom had been fiercely loyal to him, soon found themselves at odds with each other as their ambitions grew. A legacy shattered. Alexander the Great's vision of a united empire died with him, but his legacy lived on in the Hellenistic world. The Greek language, culture, and ideas spread across the empire, influencing regions from Egypt to India. The Diadochi Wars left a lasting impact on the Mediterranean and Near East, shaping the course of history for centuries to come. What had once been a single, mighty empire splintered into multiple kingdoms, each vying for dominance. But the cultural impact of Alexander's conquests would forever shape the future. The Diadochi Wars, an inescapable cycle of power struggles. The story of the Diadochi is not just about battles and politics. It is a reflection of the human drive for power and control. The ultimate failure of Alexander's empire serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of great empires. It shows how power vacuums, even after the death of a charismatic leader, can lead to endless conflict. But beyond the bloodshed and betrayal, there was also a profound cultural transformation. The legacy of Alexander was not in his ability to conquer, but in his ability to spread Greek culture far beyond its homeland. The echoes of Alexander's reign can still be felt in the cultures of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Asia. As we continue to explore the wars of the Diadochi, we'll uncover more about the shifting alliances, the critical battles, and the key figures who determined the fate of Alexander's empire. The early conflicts and political struggles. The flame of rebellion. In the wake of Alexander's sudden death, the empire that had been united by his indomitable will began to splinter into fragments. The echoes of the clash of swords, the sound of distant thunder from the great campaigns that Alexander led, could still be felt across the ancient world. But without him, the once cohesive empire seemed fragile and vulnerable. The first signs of rebellion came not from external enemies, but from within the heart of Alexander's own empire, where his most trusted generals and advisors now stood poised to fight for control. These were the early struggles, the intricate political games that would determine the future of the Greek world and its dominions. In this critical phase, the future of the empire seemed like a chessboard, with each faction fighting to control the most significant piece, the Macedonian throne. But how would these political games unfold, and who truly had the ability to hold Alexander's empire together? The dividing of the empire. The first seeds of division were sown as soon as Alexander died. His empire, vast and sprawling, needed a system of governance to sustain it. But who would step into the power vacuum? Several prominent figures emerged, each proposing different visions for the empire's future. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable generals and trusted companions, sought to stabilize the situation by suggesting a council-based rule. Ptolemy believed that this would preserve the unity of Alexander's conquests. By dividing power between himself and the other key figures, including the regent Antipater, he hoped to avoid infighting and preserve the dream of a unified empire. However, this idea was rooted in an idealistic view of cooperation that seemed out of place in a world filled with ruthless ambition. Then, there was the more direct approach proposed by Antipater, the regent of Macedonia. Antipater, who had served under Alexander in several campaigns, had his eyes set on solidifying his control over the heart of the empire, Macedonia itself. He didn't trust the idea of a council. His vision was one where power was centralized, and loyalty was to be maintained by force, not negotiation. This vision of a strong, centralized rule was seen as the most pragmatic by many, but it would require the suppression of opposition, especially in Greece. Antipater's campaign. In the early months after Alexander's death, Antipater was forced to put his vision into action. Revolts erupted in the southern Greek cities, and the anti-Macedonian sentiment grew. The people, tired of Macedonian rule, were quick to seize the opportunity for rebellion. Greece, which had been subjugated by Alexander, now saw a chance to break free from Macedonian dominance. To quell these uprisings, Antipater mustered a formidable army and set off towards Greece. But his task would not be as easy as he had anticipated. The Thessalian cavalry, one of his key allies, betrayed him, throwing the Macedonian forces into disarray. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a political one as well. The betrayal of the Thessalian cavalry shook Antipater's position, and for a time, it seemed as though the rebellion in Greece might spread beyond his control. The setback forced Antipater to retreat to Lamia, a strategic city in Thessaly, to regroup and rethink his tactics. It was here, in the heart of Greece, that the next critical phase of the struggle for Alexander's empire would unfold. The siege of Lamia and the Battle of Melatea. The rebellious forces, led by Leosthenes, laid siege to Lamia, confident that the fall of the city would break Antipater's hold on Greece once and for all. Leosthenes, a former officer in Alexander's army, knew the stakes were high. Victory would not only mean the end of Macedonian rule in Greece, but also signal a powerful shift in the balance of power across the empire. The siege itself was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Antipater's forces, though experienced, struggled against the well-organized anti-Macedonian army. But the real turning point came during the Battle of Melatea, which unfolded after weeks of relentless fighting. In the heat of the battle, Antipater's forces suffered a devastating blow when they lost their cavalry to a bold attack by the Thessalians, a key turning point in the conflict. Without their cavalry, the Macedonian forces were left vulnerable. Despite this loss, Antipater's forces fought valiantly on the high ground, employing their superior infantry tactics. In a desperate attempt to hold on to the city, they pushed back the anti-Macedonian forces, but it was clear that the battle was far from over. This engagement proved to be a pivotal moment in the struggle for Greece. The Macedonian forces, though triumphant, knew that their victory was hollow. The Greeks had tasted the power of rebellion, and it was only a matter of time before they rose again. The power struggle, the price of ambition. This early conflict underscores a critical point about the nature of empire building and the exercise of power. Alexander's empire, built on the iron will and vision of one man, was crumbling under the weight of ambition, betrayal, and division. The struggle for control of the empire was not just a battle of armies, but of ideologies. Antipater's approach, centralized and authoritarian, was in direct opposition to the more idealistic, council-based governance that Ptolemy championed. What became clear in the early days of the conflict was that loyalty to Alexander's memory was not enough to hold his empire together. The key question at the time was whether Alexander's empire could survive the loss of its central figure. Alexander's brilliance had unified a vast and diverse world under one banner. But now, in his absence, the empire's disparate cultures, kingdoms, and peoples sought to find their own path forward. The Diadochi, Alexander's successors, were not mere military leaders. They were political visionaries, each with their own idea of what the empire should become. But more often than not, their vision collided with the reality of their own ambitions. A shattered dream or a new beginning. As we explore the political chaos of the early Diadochi wars, it becomes clear that Alexander's dream of a unified empire was doomed to failure. The very structure of his empire was too fragile, too dependent on his personal charisma and leadership. What followed in the wake of his death was a struggle not just for power, but for the soul of the empire itself. In the next part of the story, we will continue to explore the intense political and military struggles that define the era. How did the Diadochi shape the Hellenistic world? What were the consequences of their battles for Alexander's vision? And what can we learn from the way power was contested in those ancient days? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into this fascinating period of history examining the rise of new dynasties, the fate of cities like Alexandria, and the shifting cultural influences that would leave a lasting impact on the ancient world. The role of Eumenes and the political turmoil, the shattered dream of unity. As the early stages of the Diadochi Wars unfolded, the dream of a unified empire under Alexander the Great seemed increasingly unattainable. The political chessboard that had once been ruled by Alexander's single hand was now divided into smaller, rival factions, each seeking power in the wake of his death. This part of our story brings us to one of the more intriguing and often overlooked figures in the early years after Alexander's demise, Eumenes of Cardia. Eumenes was an outsider in the world of the Diadochi. Unlike many of the other generals who had served directly under Alexander, Eumenes was a Greek who had earned his position through intellect and ability, rather than birthright or military prowess. But this same intelligence, which had brought him to the forefront, would also prove to be his greatest challenge. His role in the political intrigue that followed Alexander's death offers fascinating insights into the nature of power struggles, loyalty, and betrayal that defined this period of history. The fragile power of Philip III and Eurydice. At the heart of the turmoil in the early years after Alexander's death were two figures who were technically rulers of the empire, but in reality, they held no true power. Philip III Aridaeus and his wife, Eurydice. Philip III, Alexander's half-brother, was mentally impaired and incapable of ruling, yet he had been named King of Macedon. The empire, however, was effectively governed by the regent, Perdiccas, who had ambitious plans of his own. Eurydice, the wife of Philip III, became a key figure in the power struggle as she sought to gain control over the regency through her husband. Her actions, driven by a desire to elevate her own family and secure her position, would bring about significant political unrest. Cynae, the daughter of King Amyntas III and Alexander's half-sister, sought to restore the power of her family, and her machinations would lead to devastating consequences for those around her. Cynae's power play and political tensions. Cynae's challenge to Perdiccas' authority set the stage for a violent and turbulent period. She tried to use her daughter, Statira, as a pawn in her attempt to marry her off to Philip III and strengthen her own claim to power. However, this move backfired. Perdiccas, determined to maintain his grip on the regency, had Cynae killed, further solidifying his control over the empire. But this act would spark deep resentment among the royal family and the Macedonian aristocracy, further destabilizing an already fragile political situation. The tension between the generals who were fighting for control, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Seleucus, would only escalate, and betrayal would become a constant theme. It was not just a battle for territories, but for the loyalty of key supporters, many of whom were motivated by personal gain rather than loyalty to the memory of Alexander. The distrust and manipulation that characterized this time made it impossible for any one figure to fully consolidate power. The collapse of a vision. One of the most dramatic moments in this chaotic period was the assassination of Perdiccas. After years of maintaining the illusion of unity among the Diadochi, his authoritarian approach finally alienated those who had once supported him. As regent, he sought to impose his will on the empire, making decisions that many found unsatisfactory. His failure to manage the growing tensions between his fellow generals, coupled with his decision to invade Egypt to confront Ptolemy, marked the beginning of his downfall. The story of his assassination is as much about political dynamics as it is about the deadly nature of power struggles. Perdiccas was killed by his own men who were fed up with his leadership. The fact that the regent's own soldiers turned on him speaks volumes about the fragility of his power. The assassination itself is a vivid reminder of the price of ambition and the dangers of overreaching when trying to hold on to power. The split at Triparadisos and the division of the empire. Following the death of Perdiccas, the political struggle among the Diadochi reached a new level of intensity. In 321 BCE, a key meeting was held in Triparadisos, a crucial turning point that would result in the formal division of the empire among the Diadochi. This meeting was not just a diplomatic event. It was a battlefield of negotiation, filled with political maneuvering, backstabbing, and the ruthless determination to control pieces of the fractured empire. At Triparadisos, the empire was officially divided, with each general claiming a portion of Alexander's vast territory. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus received Babylon, Antigonus was assigned Asia Minor, and Lysimachus gained Thrace. However, despite this apparent division of power, the reality was that no one could fully trust the others. The agreements made in Triparadisos were fragile, temporary solutions that only postponed the inevitable conflict. The outsider among titans. While the Diadochi fought for control of their respective territories, Eumenes was caught in the midst of a web of political intrigue that would ultimately shape his tragic fate. As one of the few Greek commanders who had remained loyal to Alexander's memory, Eumenes found himself navigating treacherous waters. Eumenes' rise to power had been based on his military skill and strategic intelligence, but he was always viewed with suspicion by his fellow generals. Despite his brilliance, he was an outsider, a man of Greek descent, not Macedonian royal blood, in a system built on loyalty to the Macedonian royal family. His role in the early years of the Diadochi Wars was critical, but his position was always tenuous. Eumenes was loyal to Alexander's vision of a unified empire, yet this loyalty made him a target for those who saw him as a threat to their ambitions. The prison of politics. As Eumenes continued to navigate the political turmoil, he found himself increasingly isolated. His enemies, most notably Antigonus, were steadily consolidating power. Antigonus, who had been one of Alexander's closest commanders, grew more ambitious with each passing day, believing himself to be the rightful successor to Alexander's empire. Eumenes, meanwhile, was trapped in the remote region of Nora, where his position grew weaker by the day. It was in Nora that Eumenes was forced to make one of the most difficult decisions of his life. Should he abandon his loyalty to Alexander's vision and join forces with Antigonus, or should he continue to fight for what he believed was right, even if it meant facing certain death? Eumenes chose to continue the fight, knowing that the vision of a unified empire was slipping further away with each passing day. The role of Eumenes, a tragic hero in a world of betrayals. Eumenes' story is one of deep tragedy and political complexity. In a world dominated by betrayal, ambition, and shifting allegiances, he remained a loyalist to the ideals of Alexander the Great. But his loyalty came at a cost. His inability to align himself with the powerful Diadochi led to his downfall. In many ways, Eumenes' struggle serves as a metaphor for the challenges faced by any leader who tries to hold onto a vision of unity and fairness in a world that is more concerned with personal power. His downfall is a lesson in the fragility of ideals in the face of overwhelming political and military pressure. Ultimately, Eumenes was defeated by his own sense of duty to Alexander's vision, a vision that could not survive in a world where pragmatism and personal ambition reigned supreme. The fragmentation of Alexander's empire. As we move forward in this saga, the fate of Eumenes serves as a poignant reminder that the idealistic dream of a unified empire was doomed from the beginning. The political fragmentation that occurred after Alexander's death was inevitable. The power struggles between the Diadochi would continue to shape the Hellenistic world, leading to the establishment of several great dynasties. But none of them would be able to recreate the unity and vision that Alexander had once embodied. The rise of Antigonos and the major battles. The shadow of ambition. In the chaotic aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, one figure stood above the others in his relentless ambition. Antigonus I Monophthalmus, known as Antigonus the One-Eyed. His rise to power was marked by a series of strategic maneuvers, political alliances, and military campaigns, driven by an insatiable thirst for control over Alexander's vast empire. In this part of our story, we delve into Antigonus's meteoric rise, the significant battles he fought, and the tumultuous campaigns that defined his legacy. Through these events, we will uncover the brutal reality of power struggles during the Diadochi Wars, where military might and political cunning went hand in hand. Antigonus's ambition and the divided empire. Antigonus's story begins after the death of Alexander, when the empire was divided among his generals, the Diadochi. Like many of the other commanders, Antigonus sought to consolidate power, but he had a vision that transcended the fragmented empire. He wanted to restore the unity of Alexander's empire under his own rule. This vision would drive him into conflict with almost all of the other Diadochi. leading to a series of military campaigns that shaped the course of the Hellenistic world. One of Antigonus's most ambitious moves was his attempt to seize control of the territories in Asia Minor and the Levant, regions that were strategically important for trade and military power. His initial success in these areas positioned him as one of the most formidable of the Diadochi, but the challenges he faced were monumental. With each battle, the question was not whether he could win, but whether he could maintain the loyalty of his soldiers and allies in a time of ever-shifting allegiances. The turning point. In 312 BCE, one of the most significant battles in Antigonus's campaign took place at Gaza. This battle was pivotal not only because of its military significance, but also because it highlighted Antigonus's rising power in the eastern Mediterranean. Gaza, a city located on the southern coast of modern-day Israel, had been a strategic point in the region, controlling access to Egypt and the Levant. Antigonus, alongside his son Demetrius, sought to assert control over the region, facing off against Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's former generals who had secured control over Egypt. The battle was intense, with the forces of Antigonus and Ptolemy clashing in a struggle for dominance. The confrontation was brutal, with Antigonus hoping to weaken Ptolemy's grip on the region and establish his own supremacy. However, the battle did not end in his favor. Despite his military prowess, Antigonus and Demetrius were unable to fully capture Gaza. The Nabateans, who controlled the region's trade routes, had thrown their support behind Ptolemy, and their resistance played a significant role in the outcome of the battle. The Nabatean kingdom was becoming a formidable force, and its influence in the region would prove to be a key factor in the power dynamics of the time. A setback for Antigonus. The Nabateans had long been masters of the trade routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula with the Mediterranean world. They controlled the vital paths through which goods like spices, incense, and silks flowed, giving them significant economic leverage over the region. For Antigonus, securing these trade routes was essential to consolidating his control, but the Nabateans had no intention of allowing a foreign power to dominate them. In the aftermath of the Battle of Gaza, Antigonus's forces attempted to move further into the Nabatean territory, hoping to secure the trade routes and expand their control. However, the Nabateans, led by their king Aretas I, put up fierce resistance. Their ability to control the trade routes meant that they were not only a military power but an economic one as well. Antigonus's army, despite its size and training, struggled to navigate the harsh desert terrain, and their attempts to force the Nabateans into submission were thwarted. This first confrontation between the two forces was a setback for Antigonus, marking a significant failure in his expansionist ambitions. It was a humbling moment, showing that even the might of Antigonus could not overcome the combined forces of local knowledge, economic power, and resilient leadership. Antigonus's defeat and setbacks. After the failure in Gaza, Antigonus did not relent in his ambition. His forces regrouped and tried again to assert control over the Nabatean kingdom, but by now, the political situation had changed. The alliances among the Diadochi were becoming increasingly volatile, and each faction sought to solidify its own power. Antigonus, aware that his enemies were closing in on him, had to take a more aggressive stance. In 307 BCE, Antigonus attempted once more to push into Nabatean territory. This time, he took a different approach, attempting to outflank the Nabateans by establishing a base near the Dead Sea. However, the local geography, combined with the Nabateans' expert knowledge of the desert, made this another costly campaign for Antigonus. Despite the presence of Demetrius, whose naval experience should have been an asset, the confrontation ended in failure. The Nabateans successfully repelled the invading forces, and Antigonus was forced to retreat. This third confrontation was a significant blow to Antigonus's plans for the region. His ambitions had been dashed not by a rival army, but by the resilience and tactical brilliance of the Nabateans. His failure to secure control over the region marked the beginning of a series of setbacks that would weaken his position among the other Diadochi. A tragic end to an ambitious legacy. Despite the setbacks and defeats, Antigonus's ambition remained unshaken. He continued to pursue his vision of a united empire, but the winds of fortune were no longer in his favor. His aggressive tactics and refusal to negotiate with the other Diadochi ultimately led to his downfall. In 301 BCE, Antigonus met his tragic end at the Battle of Ipsus, where his forces faced a coalition of rival generals, including Seleucus and Lysimachus. The battle was one of the largest and most decisive of the Diadochi wars. Antigonus, despite his military skill and strategic insight, could not overcome the combined forces of his rivals. He was killed in the battle, and his death marked the end of his dream to restore Alexander's empire under his rule. Antigonus's death sent shockwaves through the Hellenistic world, signaling the end of one of the most ambitious and violent chapters in the history of the Diadochi Wars. His legacy, while marked by numerous military campaigns and battles, ultimately served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the price of power. The tragic hero of Antigonus. Antigonus's rise and fall exemplify the tragic nature of the Diadochi Wars. Like many of the other generals who sought to claim Alexander's legacy, he was driven by ambition and a desire for power, but he was also a victim of the very forces he sought to control. His unwavering belief that he could unite the empire under his rule led him into conflict with almost every other Diadochi, and ultimately, it was his inability to adapt to the changing political landscape that led to his demise. Antigonus's legacy is a reminder of the price of unchecked ambition. His story is one of daring ambition and catastrophic failure, a narrative that serves as a timeless lesson in the dangers of pursuing power at all costs. His death was not just a loss for his supporters, but for the broader vision of a unified empire under one ruler, a vision that would never be realized. The fragmentation continues. The death of Antigonus marked the end of a significant chapter in the Diadochi Wars, but it also signified that the dream of a unified empire was fading further into the past. As the Diadochi continued to battle for control, the empire of Alexander the Great splintered even more. The future of the Hellenistic world would be shaped not by the grand vision of one man, but by a collection of competing powers, each seeking to carve out their own dominion. And while Antigonus's dream of unification died with him, the legacy of his military campaigns continued to influence the course of history in the centuries to come. The collapse of the Argead dynasty and the end of Antigonus's dream. The final shadows of a dying empire. The story of the Argead dynasty, which had once ruled an empire that stretched from Greece to India, ends in the most tragic and inconspicuous way imaginable. After the death of Alexander the Great, the empire that he built began to crumble under the weight of internal conflict, betrayal, and ambition. In this final part of our narrative, we will explore the fall of the last heirs of the Argead bloodline, Alexander IV and his mother Roxanne, and the dramatic final confrontations that marked the end of the dreams of those who sought to restore Alexander's empire. The downfall of the Argead dynasty wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, tragic erosion of the legacy of a king who once conquered the known world. We will also take a closer look at how these events influenced the final battles between the remaining Diadochi generals, including the ultimate downfall of Antigonus I Monophthalmus and the collapse of his dream to unify the empire under his rule. This part of the story is crucial to understanding the broader implications of Alexander's death, as the empire fractured into pieces, each one fighting for dominance. The silent death of the heir. The tragic fate of Alexander IV, the son of Alexander the Great, is one of history's great ironies. Born to a father who had swept through the ancient world with unstoppable force, Alexander IV's life was one of fragility and helplessness. When his father died in 323 BCE, the infant Alexander IV became the nominal ruler of the empire, with his mother Roxanne acting as regent. However, the reality of the situation was far different. The empire was already in the midst of a power struggle among Alexander's generals, the Diadochi, and Alexander IV was nothing more than a figurehead, a pawn in a deadly game of politics. Roxanne, once the cherished wife of Alexander, was powerless to protect her son. In the chaos following Alexander's death, his generals divided the empire among themselves, each staking a claim to the territories they controlled. The boy king, though born of royal blood, had no power or influence of his own. The generals, aware of his symbolic importance, feared that the young Alexander IV might one day rise to challenge them. His death was inevitable, and it came quietly. Around 310 BCE, when Alexander IV was still a teenager, the ambitious regent Cassander, one of Alexander's former generals, took matters into his own hands. He saw in Alexander IV a potential rallying point for resistance, something that could undermine his own ambitions. Rather than openly kill the young heir, Cassander orchestrated a covert assassination, ensuring that the boy would not become a threat to his rule. In the end, Alexander IV and his mother Roxanne were quietly murdered, their deaths unannounced to avoid backlash from the Macedonian people. The Argead dynasty, which had ruled Macedon for centuries, died without a public funeral, and the great legacy of Alexander the Great was extinguished in silence. This silent death of Alexander IV marked the definitive collapse of the Argead dynasty. It was a tragedy not just for the boy and his mother, but for the idea of a unified empire under the Macedonian banner. The very idea of Alexander the Great's empire, an empire that once stretched from Greece to India, was now a distant memory, shattered by the ruthless ambition of the Diadochi. The end of Antigonus's dream. The political climate following the death of Alexander IV was a storm of ambition, betrayal, and warfare. The remaining Diadochi, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander, all had their eyes set on controlling the empire. Yet the most formidable and visionary among them was Antigonus I Monophthalmus. For a brief time, he seemed poised to unite the fractured empire under his banner. His ambition knew no bounds, and he launched multiple military campaigns in an attempt to bring the empire back together. However, Antigonus's dream was doomed from the start. While he won some battles and earned a reputation as a master strategist, he was ultimately outmatched by the combined might of his enemies. In 301 BCE, the final and decisive battle between the Diadochi took place at Ipsus. It was here that Antigonus's dream of reuniting Alexander's empire was shattered forever. The Battle of Ipsus was one of the largest and bloodiest of the Diadochi wars. Antigonus, with his vast forces, faced a coalition of his former allies, including Seleucus and Lysimachus, who had grown wary of his increasing power. The forces were evenly matched, but the key to victory lay not in numbers, but in strategy and leadership. Seleucus, whose forces had previously been seen as a secondary power, had gained the upper hand through a series of clever tactics and alliances. The battle was catastrophic for Antigonus. Despite his efforts, he was defeated, and in the chaos of the battle, Antigonus himself was killed. His death was a turning point in the Diadochi Wars. It was the death of not just a general but of a vision that sought to reunite the empire under a single ruler. Antigonus's ambition had led him to fight for something that could never be restored. With his death, the final hope for a united empire under the Argead line was extinguished. The aftermath of Ipsus saw the further fragmentation of Alexander's empire. While Antigonus had fought to bring it back together, his defeat solidified the reality that the empire would never be unified again. Instead, it would be divided into multiple Hellenistic kingdoms, each led by a different Diadochi general. Seleucus would rule over the eastern part of the empire, Ptolemy over Egypt, Lysimachus over Thrace, and Cassander over Macedonia. The legacy of the Argead dynasty. The fall of the Argead dynasty and the death of Alexander IV were not just the end of a family line, they were the end of an era. Alexander the Great had been a singular figure, a conqueror who united the known world through sheer force of will and military prowess. But after his death, the empire he created fell apart under the pressure of competing ambitions. The once unified empire fragmented into smaller kingdoms, and the dream of a global Macedonian empire disappeared. However, while the Argead dynasty came to an end, the influence of Alexander's legacy endured. The Hellenistic world, despite its fragmentation, became a realm of cultural and intellectual exchange, where Greek culture, philosophy, and arts flourished in cities like Alexandria and Antioch. The battles fought and the bloodshed of the Diadochi Wars were not in vain. They contributed to the shaping of a new world order that would endure long after the Macedonian Empire had faded from history. The tragic end of a great legacy. The tragic fate of Alexander IV and the collapse of Antigonus's dream illustrate the volatile and often unpredictable nature of power in the ancient world. The Diadochi Wars were defined by shifting alliances, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. These power struggles remind us that history is often shaped by those who can maintain power, not necessarily those who are most capable or most deserving. The story of Alexander's death and the subsequent fragmentation of his empire is a cautionary tale about the fragility of power and the ways in which even the most legendary figures can leave behind legacies that crumble under the weight of ambition. For Antigonus, his dream of restoring the empire under a single ruler was an endeavor doomed from the start. His tragic end at Ipsus was the culmination of years of hard-fought battles and unyielding ambition. It highlights the fragility of empires and the human cost of ambition. In the broader context, the end of the Argead dynasty and the fragmentation of Alexander's empire set the stage for the rise of new powers in the ancient world. It also set a precedent for future empires, showing that even the greatest of rulers and the most unified of empires could fall apart in the face of internal conflict and external pressures. The end of the Argead dynasty and the fragmentation of Alexander's world. The fall of Alexander IV and the defeat of Antigonus marked the definitive end of the Argead dynasty and the empire built by Alexander the Great. But in the aftermath of their deaths, a new world emerged, one that would continue to evolve in the centuries to come. The Diadochi Wars would shape the Hellenistic period, a time of great cultural exchange and intellectual flourishing. While the dream of a unified empire under a single ruler died with Alexander IV and Antigonus, the legacy of their battles and ambitions would leave an indelible mark on history. As the Diadochi fought for supremacy, the world began to take shape in ways that Alexander could never have imagined. The fragmentation of his empire might have seemed like a tragedy, but it ultimately led to the creation of a new world order, one that would have a profound influence on the development of the ancient world and beyond. Conclusion and legacy of the Diadochi Wars. As the Diadochi Wars drew to a close, the once unified empire of Alexander the Great, which had stretched from Greece to India, shattered into competing Hellenistic kingdoms. What had once been a monolithic empire under the unstoppable ambition of one man now splintered into fragments, each ruled by one of Alexander's former generals. The relentless struggle for power that defined the Diadochi Wars was not simply a contest for control of lands. It was a clash of ideologies, identities, and dreams of greatness. While Alexander's death had thrown the empire into chaos, his legacy remained alive in the hearts of the men who sought to inherit his power. Some of these men were driven by personal ambition, others by a belief that they could restore the vision of Alexander, yet all were bound by the same fate. They would carve out their own kingdoms, but never the united empire that had once existed. The rise of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Following the death of Antigonus, the wars for dominance officially ended, but the world had forever changed. The territories once ruled by Alexander were now split among the Diadochi. Ptolemy, a trusted general who had served Alexander as his bodyguard, took control of Egypt, establishing a dynasty that would endure for centuries. His rule would give birth to the famous Ptolemaic kingdom, marked by a fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture, epitomized by the majestic city of Alexandria. The Ptolemies would go on to influence both Greek and Egyptian traditions, intertwining them in ways that would shape the ancient world. To the east, Seleucus, another of Alexander's generals, would carve out a vast kingdom that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. His reign gave rise to the Seleucid Empire, a melting pot of Greek, Persian, and Eastern influences. In many ways, Seleucus' kingdom stood as the heir to Alexander's vision of a blended world, though it was constantly under threat from rival factions and the ever-changing political landscape of the time. Meanwhile, Lysimachus, one of the other major Diadochi, took control of Thrace and parts of Asia Minor, securing a significant foothold in the western part of the empire. Although his rule was marked by a relative stability, his death in battle would show the fragility of these newly established kingdoms. The death of Antigonus had broken the hold of one great power, but the rise of new contenders for dominance would perpetuate the endless cycles of war and treachery. The dreamer's downfall. Antigonus was the one who had perhaps come closest to reuniting Alexander's empire. His ambition stretched far beyond merely governing. He sought to become the rightful ruler of the entire empire, an ambition that set him on a direct collision course with the other Diadochi. But Antigono's hubris led to his downfall, as his obsessive drive for total power blinded him to the realities of warfare and politics. The Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC would prove to be his undoing. In this decisive clash, Antigonos faced off against the combined forces of his rivals, including Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. Despite his impressive military prowess and the strength of his army, Antigonos was defeated and killed in battle. His death symbolized the end of the last hope of a unified empire under one ruler. Antigonos' downfall also marked a shift in the power dynamics of the ancient world. No longer would one man wield the immense power that Alexander had. The empire was now divided, and its future uncertain. Cultural shifts and territorial realignments. As the Hellenistic kingdoms took shape, they did more than just divide up the empire's lands. They also redefined the cultural and intellectual landscape of the ancient world. The Diadochi Wars had been bloody, destructive, and filled with betrayal, but they also paved the way for a new age of art, philosophy, and scientific discovery. The once Greek world was now intertwined with the cultures of the East, creating a unique blend of Hellenistic and Eastern traditions. One of the most profound impacts of this new era was the spread of Greek culture and ideas. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Seleucia on the Tigris became centers of learning, where Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists flourished. The blending of Eastern and Western thought gave rise to new schools of philosophy and new ways of understanding the world. At the same time, the wars of succession brought about a fragmentation of power. The lack of a strong central authority allowed the influence of regional rulers to grow, which in turn contributed to the weakening of the Hellenistic empires over time. The constant warfare, combined with the immense wealth accrued from the conquests, began to shift the balance of power, not only within the Hellenistic world but across the entire Mediterranean region. The legacy of the Diadochi. The legacy of the Diadochi Wars is not merely one of conquest and division, but of profound transformation. The rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth of new political systems, and the merging of cultures all had a lasting impact on the ancient world. The Hellenistic period is often remembered for its dramatic changes, from the creation of new kingdoms to the spread of Greek thought across the known world. But the question remains, did the Diadochi succeed in preserving Alexander's vision, or did their constant infighting dilute it? While some historians argue that the breakup of Alexander's empire was inevitable, others contend that a unified empire under a single ruler could have reshaped history in ways we can scarcely imagine. The period that followed the Diadochi Wars laid the foundations for the Roman Empire, which would eventually rise to dominate much of the known world. The legacy of the Diadochi and of Alexander lived on in the cities they founded, the cultures they fostered, and the minds they inspired. The world that Alexander had dreamt of was not an empire bound together by force, but a vast, interconnected network of people and ideas that transcended borders. The enduring myth of Alexander the Great. The story of Alexander the Great is a story of ambition, glory, and the insatiable desire to leave behind a legacy that would last forever. In his brief but explosive reign, he reshaped the ancient world, but it was the wars that followed his death that truly ensured his legacy would be immortalized. Alexander's empire may have crumbled, but the ideas he brought to the world lived on. The rise and fall of the Diadochi kingdoms and the legacy of the wars they fought continued to shape the trajectory of the ancient world for centuries to come. As we look back at the Diadochi Wars, we must ask ourselves, what do these events say about power, ambition, and the human condition? In the end, the struggles of Alexander's successors remind us that empires rise and fall, but the legacies of those who dare to dream of greatness are often far more enduring than the empires they sought to build. The story of the Diadochi, much like that of Alexander, is a story of dreams that were too big to last, but whose echoes continue to resonate throughout history.